All right. I think we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our August History in Our Backyard webinar. My name is Eleanor Rangers, and I'm the president of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Cold War Historical Society, a society dedicated to historical preservation of primarily oral histories of individuals who were involved in Cold War-related activities in the Southeastern Pennsylvania area. But as many of you may know, we also are involved with some historical preservation work that we do in Warminster at the site of the old Johnsville Centrifuge. Again, this is our webinar. I just want to remind folks, because I have received a couple of emails in my spam that have tried to reach out to me regarding some programming questions, but would just request that if you are not receiving emails from us and you previously received emails, please check your spam folder and make sure that you're able to receive our emails regularly, because some time ago I did change my email announcement system from MailChimp to MailerLite. So you'll get our periodic emails. So just a general reminder regarding that. Also, I have to make of course, the solicitation every month. As I've mentioned, we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and certainly rely on the generous donations of those who are interested in supporting us. So we certainly do appreciate when you are able to provide some support to our organization. And I did want to give a quick update. As I've mentioned a couple times the last few months, we do have a display room that we're in the process of actually putting together at the site of the Fuge. We have a display room that was awarded to us by the building owner. This weekend, finally, I am going to be beginning to actually set it up. I have probably about, I'd say, 75% of the initial signage ready to go. So I will be working on that with someone else who's going to help me on Saturday morning. So we're hoping to be able to open this up sometime in the fall for an initial look at Naval Air Development Center history. So stay tuned for more details. Also want to remind folks, I know sometimes you're not able to make these webinars, and we certainly would encourage you to check out our YouTube channel. I do upload the presentations following these presentations, and I also try to update the site with new content fairly regularly, so would encourage you to take a look at that. And of course, we also have a Facebook site in addition to our regular website, where we do post information about these programs, as well as some other Cold War related news periodically as well. So would encourage you, if you're on that social media platform, to check us out. I know I have most of you pretty much trained with these webinars to mute your lines for the presentation as well, and to turn off your cameras so we can preserve bandwidth. But certainly we will open up the lines for everyone to ask questions at the conclusion of the program. So thank you for your consideration. Here we are in August with TEL-2 missions, which we're going to introduce in a moment. But the balance of the year, I do want to let you guys know, because I know a number of people have asked about whether we're going to have live programming actually start up again in Warminster. And yes, in fact, in September, our next program, we are going to have Franz Bahn, who is a former engineer at the Naval Air Development Center. And he's actually going to talk about a very personal topic. And that's basically his journey from being a Yugoslavian refugee post-World War II, coming to America and basically realizing the American dream. It's a very inspiring story, and I am endeavoring to actually do a live stream of this. So we will be doing this on site in Warminster. So for those of you local to the area, definitely would encourage you to come to listen. But I'm also hoping to do this on the web as well, live from the Fuge. So I'm pretty excited about that. And then you can see we have a speaker in October, Chuck Phillips, also a former NADC alum, will be speaking about anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Of course, one of the core capabilities that was the Naval Air Development Center's, one of their centers of excellence for. And then in December, we'll have David Stumpf to round out the year, just like he started in January. We're going to have him talk about Minuteman missile vulnerability to conclude the year. Hopefully in November, I will have an annual veterans event. Hopefully that will be a live event at the Fuge as well. There will be more details coming about that probably in the early fall. Also, I am going to start planning for 2024 programming. So if you have requests for topics, if you know someone who can speak, or if you can even offer to do a presentation yourself, I'd love to hear from you. So please drop me a line at mail@coldwarhistory.org. And as I mentioned, September 14th, please join us at the Fuge for a live event with Franz Bond, talking about his personal journey from a post-World War II refugee to coming to America and basically, having a very successful career as an engineer at the Naval Air Development Center. So I would encourage you for that. For those of you not able to attend, again, I am going to be offering this via Zoom live at the Fuge, so you still will be able to tune into that as well. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our guest speaker this evening, and that is Robert Hopkins. And Robert Hopkins is an independent scholar focusing on Cold War strategic air power and aerial intelligence collection. He was a former U.S. Air Force pilot and qualified on 17 types of EC, KC, and RC-135s, and flew combat reconnaissance missions during Desert Storm. In addition to multiple publications and appearances in aviation programs on the History Channel, the Smithsonian Channel, and the BBC, Hopkins is author of books on the KC-135, the B-47, Strategic Air Command in the UK, and Cold War Strategic and Aerial Reconnaissance. He earned a PhD in the US and Soviet history from the University of Virginia. So without further ado, I am going to exit my program and turn things over to Robert.
Good evening, everyone. I ask your indulgence and bear with me here. I'm working left-handed, and that's because I just had my shoulder replaced. And my goodness, I am so right-handed, I can barely do anything left-handed. So if right in the middle of our presentation, suddenly you see my email appear, it's because I hit the wrong button. So if it weren't for Eleanor, we'd be all sunk, but I'm grateful for your understanding and patience. So without further ado, I'd like to share a little bit about the TEL-2 program, its successors, my role in those successor operations, and some opinions about the future and what it might hold thanks to the early work that was done by TEL-2 beginning in the late 1950s. If you've ever been to England, you've probably seen this in the tube. Mind the gap. What a very helpful and useful recommendation. A warning, if you will, and it makes a lot of sense because you don't want to trip, you don't want to hurt yourself getting into the subway, but it's also not necessarily something that would lead to hysteria. It's not a big deal. You want to make sure you're safe, but you don't want to do something stupid. Unfortunately, this whole notion of gap, if you're familiar with the Cold War, had a great and significant impact, beginning with the bomber gap. In July 1955, the Soviets flew a handful of MYA-4 Bison bombers on the aviation day. And of course, the American observers dutifully burned off a bunch of Kodachrome slides and black and white photographs and were really excited to see these. And as they flew off into the distance and you couldn't see them anymore, they turned back and started photographing some of the MiG-19s and the other airplanes that were in the display. And a few minutes later, another batch of Bisons appeared. Suddenly, the same people who had been taking the photographs of the first group began to panic. Oh my gosh, if they've got 18 or 20 of these things flying right now, there must be hundreds of them sitting on the ramp somewhere. Well, as you may know, there weren't hundreds of them sitting somewhere. The airplanes had just flown in a great big circle, and American observers were completely duped into believing that the Soviets had far more bombers than the United States did, and in fact, more bombers than anyone reasonably would have had. And that led, of course, to the bomber gap. And if you followed Stanley Kubrick, you know we had the bomber gap and the missile gap, and of course the mine shaft gap, because we God forbid, wouldn't want the Soviet ambassador to see the big board, because the whole notion of the Cold War was, well, from my perspective, a lot of it was theater. It was hysteria. There was almost a sense of panic rather than reasonable understanding or reasonable expectations. And this affected not only the military, but it affected the political spectrum as well. Americans in 1955 suddenly began to wonder if their president was spending too much time on the golf course and not enough time in the White House. I mean, why like Ike? Because all he does is play bridge with his friends, he goes golfing. There's a lot more going on. And as you know, in 1955, it's the run up to the election. And of course, most Americans had not yet heard of the Suez Canal, and they had certainly not heard of Hungary and were unaware of events that would transpire that year. But ultimately, the bomber gap had a profound effect on the American psyche because, well, gee, we used to be impervious to the Soviet threat. But if they had all these bombers, especially jet bombers, they could reach the United States and drop atom bombs on our cities. OMG, that's just catastrophic. And it's going to happen because Eisenhower was irresponsible. He wasn't taking care of what mattered. I mean, after all, high school kids were building hot rods and going to dances, listening to decadent rock and roll music. And Soviet high school students were doing physics and building bombers and all kinds of scientific activities. So there was a strong undertone to the bomber gap that was driven by a perception that the United States was behind in technology, despite the fact that it wasn't. And as you can fully appreciate, this sort of hysteria exists today with a variety of political issues, and it's certainly nothing new in the 50s either. But it was a theme that resonated throughout the Cold War. A year after the bomber gap erupted, Ike finally was vindicated privately when people like Hervé Stockman, Carmine Vito, and Marty Knudsen flew U-2 missions over the Soviet Union, over Balbasova Air Base, and actually photographed the ramp and showed, oh my goodness, there just aren't that many Soviet bombers. Yeah, they have some medium-range Tupolev 16s, the Badgers. Those are comparable to the B-47, but geez Louise, they don't have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bombers waiting to strike the US. But remember, the U-2 data were not available. The photographs were not available to the public. So during the election run-up in 1956, Adlai Stevenson and some of the Democratic hawks, especially Lyndon Johnson and others, were able to make the claim that Nixon, Vice President Nixon, and President Eisenhower were soft on defense. And of course, that led many people to believe that the United States suddenly engaged in a mass production of bombers. I took this quote from a history book because it reflects this sort of misuse of history. The second sentence begins, over 2,000 B-47s and almost 750 B-52s were built to match the imagined fleet of Soviet aircraft. None of that's true. The last B-47 was bought and paid for in 1953, 2 years before the bomber gap erupted. Of the 744 B-52s that were ultimately built, 448 had been ordered by the time the bomber gap had erupted, and that left just the B-52Gs and B-52Hs, a total of 294 aircraft. So despite this historian claiming that nearly 3,000 aircraft were built to match the imagined fleet of Soviet aircraft, the bomber gap simply was not the hysterical event that its advocates argued. Lyndon Johnson got a lot of political power, so did Richard Russell and a lot of the other hawks in Congress, and that was about it. But it set the stage for what followed. If you remember in 1957, suddenly the United States was thrust upon yet another gap. And this time it wasn't a bomber gap with maybe an 8-hour warning of bombers en route to the United States. Instead, it was the missile gap. Because suddenly these ballistic missiles that launched Sputnik into outer space could also carry nuclear weapons to the United States. And once again, Eisenhower was complacent. We were unaware of the threat. We were unable to match what would happen in the Soviet Union with our own capabilities. I mean, if you watch videos of the American space program, it's hilarious to see these Redstone rockets explode on the launch pad at at the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral nowadays. It was all simply one more example of how Eisenhower was out of touch as president and soft on defense. I'm going to interject a personal note here. Let me suggest that you never, ever, ever nickname your grandson Sput after Sputnik or some other current event, because the emotional scars that leaves ultimately will result in, gosh, somebody writing history books, and that's just incorrigible. At any rate, the whole notion of the missile gap was that the R-7 Semyorka, which launched Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin into space, was also the same SS-6 Sapwood that would launch atomic bombs at the United States. And of course, an atomic loaded rocket would reach the United States in 25 or 30 minutes. So warning time had dropped from hours to less than half an hour. And that meant that Americans were even more vulnerable because we couldn't take advantage of whatever pie in the sky notions of civil defense we actually had imagined would be available to us. So we began to try and figure out everything we could about the Soviet ballistic missile program, which, as far as we knew, was restricted to the Baikonur Cosmodrome. If you read Dino Brogione's books, you'll see that they called it Tiratam, TT for short, because that was the nearest railhead. And they didn't really know that it was called Baikonur Cosmodrome. So if you look at the literature, you may see several different names for the same place. And I'll use them interchangeably here simply for convenience. This raised the question ultimately, though, of how many ICBMs the Soviet Union actually had. This photograph was taken on the 4th of August, 1957 from a U-2 flown by Buster Edens on mission number 4035. That's the 4th of August, 1957. August, September, October, that's 3 months, 2 months before Sputnik hit the front pages. The CIA knew without a doubt that the Soviets did not have enough. They did not have ICBMs in quantity. However, the public relations campaign, once again, was in overdrive. Eisenhower refused to share the U-2 photographs, which would have showed that the Soviets did not have the quantity of ICBMs claimed by hardliners like Johnson and Richard Russell. And as a result, he couldn't diffuse the so-called missile gap. And that ultimately focused the issue of quantity versus quality. How good were the Soviet ICBMs? Well, this is where Strategic Air Command suddenly got involved. And they said, okay, we have the U-2 photos. And we can discuss those with Dino Brugioni and other CIA analysts, and we can discuss them with President Eisenhower. And we'll tell you that, yes, the Soviets don't have the same number of ICBMs that we think they have. It's very, very small. But you know what? They're really good. Based on what? Well, we just think they are. We also don't know if they aren't hidden somewhere. That silo at a farm could be a ICBM sitting there instead of actually corn or grain. Ultimately, what this led to was a demand for understanding how capable and effective Soviet ballistic missiles were. And that led to what was called telemetry intelligence, or TLIN. Because what the Soviets did, just like the Americans, as each ICBM or test rocket was launched, it would telemetry data back to the scientists on the ground. Well, it tells you how it's performing. Is it on speed? Is it on altitude? Is it on course? Are the components functioning properly? All these sorts of issues were reported back to the scientists via telemetry. You know what? If we could listen in on that, we could have a pretty good understanding of just how effective the Soviet ICBMs were. And guess what? We did just that. We introduced ground-based TLIN. The Diyarbakir radar in Turkey was able to collect launch boost phase data from Soviet ICBMs, not only at Baikonur, but also at the other facility, Kapustin Yar. And this gave us a much better understanding of how effective the Soviet ICBMs were. SAC, unwilling to admit that they were wrong, grumbled and said, okay, we know that they're not as effective based on telemetry, but these are just test subjects. They're fully capable rockets are certainly much better, because after all, we have to assume that they're better because we plan for the worst case. Ultimately, they also argued, SAC also argued, that because the curvature of the Earth and the distance involved from Turkey meant that we could only get the initial data from the immediate aftermath of a launch. And that meant that when the rocket was performing perfectly in the first few seconds of a mission, of course it would show it's perfectly capable. Well, what we really needed was what happens after it disappeared over the horizon so that we can try and get a better understanding of its overall capability. And that, without that evidence, SAC argued that we have to assume that the missiles are not only capable, but they're very precise as well. They're going to hit the target. We have to assume that because, well, why wouldn't we? So how do you solve the problem of range and curvature of the Earth in line of sight? Well, the solution was an aerial solution. Strategic Air Command took 3 B-47s and converted them into TLIN platforms. 2 electronic warfare officers sat in the bomb bay. If you look carefully, you can see the extended bomb bay here. And they collected the telemetry that was downloaded from each launch. A dipole antenna on the nose and a flatboard antenna on the aft fuselage, as well as a wing-mounted antenna, collected the telemetry. Later versions had different equipment, different variations of antennae, so you'll see different versions and different capabilities. But these operated from Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, and they would launch with minimal warning, and they could orbit either over the Black Sea to monitor launches from Kapustin Yar, or they would operate over Iran and collect data from launches out of Turatam. Curiously, the British actually flew a Canberra over Iran on one occasion and photographed a Tel-2 in the orbit. And somehow that photograph reached Iranian officials, which caused a little embarrassment. And there was a lot of noise about maybe not allowing the Tel-2 missions to continue over Iran. Fortunately, that all blew over because by the late 1950s, the Shah had consolidated power. We no longer had to worry about Mossadegh, thanks to the American and British coup d'etat there. And ultimately, the United States was able to collect boost phase telemetry from the 2 main Soviet launch facilities. and these were highly effective. Here's a list from September 1963 showing the many different collections, the many different missions. You'll see on 3 occasions they actually collected launches, and 2 of those have the letters PDB next to them. That stands for President's Daily Brief. I want to stress that this is a perfect example of how strategic aerial reconnaissance actually influenced policy. We've often thought, well, these missions had an effect, but we don't really know what that effect was. Well, John Kennedy and his advisors, Mac Bundy and Robert McNamara and others, were actually briefed that on the 17th of September or the 28th of September, the Soviets popped off an ICBM. We collected intelligence on it, and we know its capability. And that gave Kennedy and his advisors the leverage to be able to say to Tommy Power at SAC, I'm not convinced that the Soviet ICBMs are the threat that you say they are. They might be, but they are certainly not unequivocally as threatening as you claim them to be. And ultimately, these sorts of reports influenced policymaking. And curiously, they also influenced McNamara in a different way. As you know, McNamara was an advocate of ballistic missiles replacing bombers. And so he would look at these data and say, oh my goodness, see, the Soviets are busy with their own ICBM force because they know that bombers are not the wave of the future. So if they're focusing on ICBMs, shouldn't we? So McNamara was able to use the telemetry data from the TEL-2 missions as supporting evidence for his efforts to emasculate the bomber force and replace Strategic Air Command as a strike force with ICBMs rather than bombers. And by 1964, April of 64, he had succeeded. There were more ICBMs than bombers in SAC. TEL-2 was also useful in non-military capabilities. As early as 1959, TEL-2s collected telemetry on the first mission to the moon. And as Eleanor posted in the announcements, when Alexei Leonov walked in space for the very first time, the telemetry and voice data that he passed on were recorded by the TEL-2. Curiously, that was the source for the Americans to understand that Leonov almost did not get back inside the capsule because his suit had expanded so much that he couldn't fit into the opening. I'm sure there were other indicators and other sources, but this certainly verified the impact of how TEL-2 was able to collect this sort of information and how it was useful. One curious thing about the satellites, let's go back a slide. If you look at some of these missions in September, particularly the later missions, 7 hours, 7:30, 8:55, these are long missions. Well, what would happen is that as a satellite would be launched, the TEL-2 would collect the boost phase telemetry from the ballistic missile which launched it, the rocket which launched it. They would remain in orbit because they would await the return of the satellite having made its first circumnavigation of the Earth, at which point it would then download its initial telemetry report to the scientists at Baikonur. And that way, TEL-2 collected not only the boost phase, the launch data, but the initial report of effectiveness and operational status. So longer space missions, orbit missions for TEL-2 collected far more than just the initial data. There were, however, some serious weaknesses with the TEL-2. As I keep saying, boost phase, launch phase, it only caught it during the launch. There was no optical capability on board. The co-pilot had a 35mm camera with a 50mm lens, and that sure as heck was not going to take any pictures usable in terms of understanding what the exhaust plume or the structure looked like. And the airplane was so cramped that you couldn't put any more equipment or people on board. Ah, yes, but the U-2s participated in TLAND as well. Yes, they did. And they were higher, gave them a little more over the horizon range, but they suffered from the same problems as well. So in 1965, the US decided to replace the TEL-2 with a program called Pee-wee, and they used an RB-57F. In December of 1965, one of these Pee-wee aircraft was orbiting over the Black Sea. And I'm going to go off on a tangent here. I'm going to go out and risk my career and say this because I have the evidence to back it up. But in December of 1965, the Soviets accidentally shot down the Pee-wee RB-57F. I interviewed the General Dynamics people who collected the wreckage, and they said there was a hole in the wing big enough to drive a Volkswagen through. And the published explanation was that the crew became hypoxic and that the airplane simply fluttered down into the sea. That's inconsistent with a hole big enough to drive a Volkswagen through. Plus, both pilot and backseater were awarded the Purple Heart. Purple Hearts are not awarded to combat crews who suffer hypoxia and perish on peripheral reconnaissance flights. They're only awarded for issues related to combat. So although Boris Yeltsin did not announce that the Pee-wee aircraft was among those intentionally shot down when he provided that information to Bill Clinton in 1992, 1993, he did acknowledge that there may have been other missions that were compromised, and this is one of them. Ultimately, TEL-2 was designed to collect, as you see here, Soviet ballistic missiles that launched from Tyuratam, Kapustin Yar, Saryshgan, which was an ABM facility, but still supported launches, the rocket facility at Plesetsk, as well as sea-launched ballistic missiles from the White Sea and the Barents Sea. And those all went out to the Kura-Kluchi range on Kamchatka. And that created a real dilemma for the United States, because ultimately, the US was no longer interested in what the ballistic missile could do. They were more interested in what the warhead could do. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton very briefly to Eleanor and invite her to show you a video.
All
And
right,
as you watch the video, near the end in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see 3 objects. Watch those 3 objects and remember those, and we'll talk about those.
Пуск!
А это что такое? Лужники, что ли?
Луки вперед. Вот они, вот. Да, да.
Вот они, раз. Два.
Стоп! Сколько время на часах? 43:10.
На 2 секунды, что ли?
А вот
Thank you, Eleanor.
all right.
All right, let's see. Thank you for your patience. Ultimately, what you've just seen is the reentry of Soviet reentry vehicles, warheads, on the Kluchi-Kura test range on Kamchatka. It's interesting because those three objects that you saw, one out in front, followed by two, reflects the fact that the one in front was a decoy. Suddenly, it became important to understand not only the ballistic missiles capability, but the warheads themselves, because after all, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, the US was interested in Sprint, the anti-ballistic missile program, and the whole goal was theoretically to shoot down incoming ballistic missiles. Well, as you saw from that video, the first thing that appeared was a decoy. Obviously, Sprint would shoot at that and it would be destroyed, but the two active warheads that followed would come through unscathed. So what happened was the United States made a conscious policy decision to switch from boost phase or launch telemetry and TLENT to reentry and measurement or optical collection, so that they could better appreciate the capabilities of not just the missile itself, but the warhead and how that would actually impact a particular target. As you can imagine, MASN was far more complex than TEL-2 could accommodate, and it resulted in the use of a brand new airplane. It went through three different names, as you can see here, two different designations, but it was a bigger airplane. It had room for many cameras. It had room for many crew members. Instead of 5, there were now, maybe 11 or 12, depending on how many backenders there were, plus a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and eventually 2 navigators on board the airplane. And the airplane could fly and orbit for far longer than the TEL-2, although both were air refuelable. Suddenly, Rivet Ball, Wanda Bell, Nancy Ray, whatever you want to call it, provided a capability that was far and away beyond what TEL-2 ever promised. Operations for the Rivet Ball were from Shemya Air Force Base in Alaska at the tip of the Aleutians. It's a little farther out to Attu. There was a Coast Guard station there, but by and large, Shemya was, well, it wasn't the end of the world, but you could see it from there. Shemya was a World War II base. They flew P-38s and B-24s and some maritime patrol aircraft from there. It was 2 miles wide and 4 miles long. The runway was 150 feet wide, 10,006 feet long. And you could have simultaneous wind shear, dense fog, freezing rain and drizzle, blowing snow on one end of the runway, and calm winds and clear at the other end of the runway. If you look at this image of Shemya in the top right, it's not here on this particular view, but they also built something called Cobra Dane, which was another over-the-horizon radar that allowed collection of telemetry as well as radar data for Soviet ballistic missile launches coming to Kamchatka. The United States also attempted in the late 1980s a program called Queen Match. This was some genius idea to put the second stage of a Minuteman ICBM in a silo at Shemya, and in the event of a ballistic missile launch by the Soviets to Kamchatka, Queen Match would launch and then be able to collect telemetry and optical data from outer space, looking backward down at the reentry vehicle. Fortunately, intelligent people decided this was too dangerous, and rather than kill a lot of people at Shemya, they canceled the program. But Shemya was notable not just for its operations. Its sole inhabitants were foxes. During the 1800s, Russian fur traders would sail their ships up close to the shore. They'd throw fox kits off into the water. who they'd swim to the shore, and the survivors would be collected the following year or two and sold for pelts back in Russia. We saw the foxes on a regular basis, and Shemya had a lot to offer. For example, double dipping. If you were really brave, you went swimming in the Pacific Ocean, which is on the west side of or the south side of the island there. And then you got in a pickup truck and you drove real quickly to the north side of the island and jumped into the Bering Sea. If you were really daring, you didn't wear anything throughout this process. So double dipping is a particularly exciting event, but has very little to do with the history of TEL-2, but everything to do with the warped mentality of crew dogs who have absolutely nothing to do in between operational sorties. So on behalf of all of us who enjoyed those moments, I hope you'll appreciate that we weren't bored. On the other side of the world in 1967, events resulted in the relocation of the TEL-2 from Incirlik. The Turkish government said, we don't want you here anymore. Please move your airplanes. So the Air Force moved them to Tripoli in Libya. And as you can imagine, the distance involved added greatly to the amount of time to get an airplane on station, collect, and in fact, it was almost worthless because the airplanes couldn't get there in time. In June of '67, the Arab-Israeli war broke out, and the TEL-2s were relocated yet again from Tripoli to Torrejon Air Base in Spain. And that was officially the death knell of the whole TEL-2 program in the Middle East, because there's no way to fly from Spain to the Black Sea or Iran inside of an hour, which is the only effective warning time they might have of an impending launch. So in 1967, it appeared unequivocally that the TEL-2 program was doomed and was about ready to come to an end. However, the rivet ball needed maintenance. It had been flying for almost 2 years at Shemya, and it was time for its routine program depot maintenance. So with the rivet ball down in Texas at E-Systems, getting its equipment upgraded and engines checked and 6 months of program depot maintenance, somebody had to cover potential launches from Shemya. So they sent in the second string. And the TEL-2s flew back out to Shemya and were very successful. During their first month, they flew 7 op sorties. They collected on 2. And this is pretty impressive because Shemya, as I alluded to, had horrible weather conditions. The crosswinds were just atrocious. 2 rivet balls, the rivet ball plus a Cobra ball, crashed during landing at Shemya, largely because of the weather. The first in 1969 because icing on the runway, the second just bad weather and poor piloting skills. So the B-47 was notorious for handling in crosswinds. And in 1965 at Incirlik, one of the 3 TEL-2s had returned from a mission and the crosswinds were out of limits, just like they were often out of limits at Shemya. So the pilot, Walt Savage, decided to orbit and wait for the crosswinds to die down. Unfortunately, there was no plan B, and the ground staff said, well, you're just going to have to keep orbiting because we can't let you fly to some other divert base because your mission's so secret, we can't risk the compromise. So yeah, just keep orbiting and we'll hope that the winds die down. Unfortunately, the winds didn't die down and the TEL-2 ran out of gas. So Walt Savage said, okay, I'm going to have to land out of crosswind limits. He made a smooth approach, he made a smooth landing, but unfortunately, the wind picked up, lifted the wing, and the next thing you knew, the airplane flipped and crashed. 2 of the crew on board were killed. The same thing almost happened at Shemya in 1966. And there was a very clear understanding that there would be no more missions from Shemya, and there would be no future for the TEL-2 because ultimately SAC had other assets in place. The Rivet Amber was yet another version of the RC-135. And as you see here, there's a large gray area on the side of the fuselage. That's a fiberglass insert, which covered a Hughes radar. And the radar was slaved to a ballistic streak camera that was behind the optical window you see just to the left of the fiberglass. So Rivet Amber could actually track a reentry vehicle using this radar, and the camera would monitor it and follow it along, and they would get spectroscopic data, optical data, and a wide variety of other MASINT that they would use to determine the capabilities of the Soviet reentry vehicles. Because the radar was a power hog and required massive amounts of electricity far beyond the airplane's TF-33 engine's capability, General Dynamics installed an external power unit. It was essentially a Lycoming engine that produced additional electricity. The radar also produced an inordinate amount of heat, so they needed a cooling pod. And if you look carefully, you can see under the right wing the electrical pod. And if you look very carefully, you can just barely see the cooling pod under the left wing. And that has given rise to claims of a 6-engine RC-135. Not so, there were only 4 engines, but you can understand how that was made. Just like the TEL-2, Rivet Amber suffered an ignominious fate in June of 1969 after a flight in severe turbulence off the coast of the Soviet Union. Rivet Amber was flying home from Shemya to Eielson Air Force Base. The vertical stabilizer separated, the aircraft disappeared, and all 19 souls on board were lost. It's never been found. So the whole program of TEL-2 and its successors has been subject to a variety of tragedies. As I said, the original rivet ball ran off the end of the runway in 1969. John Acor, who was the aircraft commander, effectively saved the program because although the aircraft itself was damaged beyond repair, there were no fatalities, and all the systems equipment on board was preserved so they could put it into a new aircraft. So between the loss of Rivet Ball in January of 69 and Rivet Amber in June of 1969, there was essentially nothing that would cover the window of opportunity to track Soviet ballistic missile testing. But again, that's 2 years into the future, because in 1967, SAC said, well, we're just going to retire the RB-47 fleet in general, and we'll also park the TEL-2s at the Boneyard, Mastic. So effectively, that brought the TEL-2 story itself to an end. But there were the successors, as I mentioned, Cobra Ball, Rivet Ball. Those missions continued through the 1980s. And even to the point where President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative got involved with the Cobra I program. This was sponsored jointly by the US Army and the US Air Force. And in fact, this airplane, the Cobra I, is arguably the single most expensive aircraft ever built. $1.4 billion for this single example. Well, the B-2, no, see, that's amortized over 21 aircraft. We could quibble over that, and I'd be happy to arm wrestle with you sometime. But first of all, they trusted me with this aircraft. I was pleased to say that my crew flew the first operational Cobra I sortie in 1989, for which we received the O'Malley Award for the best reconnaissance crew in the Air Force. But it clearly was linked to the history of TEL-2, and it was clearly linked to the ability to collect reentry data. You can just see the sensor visible inside the cavity. and it was cooled with liquid nitrogen when on the ground because the heat signature sensitivity of the sensor was such that from 2,000 nautical miles away, it could pick up the heat signature of a basketball in space. And the value of that was to be able to detect decoys and other reentry vehicles that were not the same material as actual warheads, because the whole premise of SDI was to be able to discriminate with specific targets so it wouldn't waste time shooting down the wrong ones or decoys. And again, the legacy here for even the Cobra I program began in 1958, 1959 with the TEL-2 program. Cobra Ball is still alive and well. This is actually the same airplane, 128, that was the Cobra I. And as you can see, it has 3 tiny little windows in the front and 2 even tinier windows. So where once it had all these huge optically ground windows for Mazant collection, it's now so sophisticated that you don't need all kinds of cameras. Smaller gear works. The telemetry collection is now contained within the cheeks that you see there in front of the wings. And the whole program remains one of the most essential within the United States Air Force today for peacetime missions. And that raises a serious problem. Right now, the United States Air Force is working very hard to eliminate pilots and eliminate any mission that doesn't have anything to do with warfighting. And unfortunately, the TEL-2 legacy isn't a warfighting mission. It's designed to provide peacetime intelligence that would hopefully allow policymakers and planners effective tools to understand potential threats and the appropriate response to that. So I am a little biased here when I say that programs like Cobra Ball simply do not have the support of the US Air Force in austere budget times. And so who knows what the legacy of TEL-2 will be for the future? Will there be a replacement, or will the warfighting mentality in the Air Force offices and the Pentagon E-ring ultimately result in the elimination of programs like Cobra Ball simply because they don't have a viable combat role? Some of you may know that the Cobra Ball has been used in combat, but I think this was more, let's fill a square to say we've done it. It is not survivable in a high threat environment. It is not survivable in a combat environment where it's trying to collect ballistic missile data like Scuds during Desert Storm. It is invaluable in monitoring North Korean missile launches. It is invaluable in monitoring Pakistani and Indian missile launches to be able to provide diplomats and policymakers with the data they need to effectively develop and implement arms control agreements and understanding ways to address non-proliferation. But that's not necessarily what the Air Force wants. So the future of TEL-2 and its successors is questionable. I wish I had a better thing to say, a better report to share with you. But ultimately, the legacy has been very impressive. First of all, the TEL-2s collected invaluable data which presidents use in making policy decisions. It provided intelligence data on civil issues such as the Luna program and the first walk in space. And ultimately, it concluded with developing the capabilities that we've seen over the past 50 years to assess foreign ballistic missile development and warhead capability. And I, for one, consider my participation in the Cobra Ball and Cobra I program to have not only been the highlight of my Air Force career, but we were actually part and parcel of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, Shoot to Destruction. And so I'm proud to say that what I did in a TEL-2 successor in the Cobra Ball, in a small way, contributed to peace and stability during the Cold War. It's unfortunate that the US is withdrawn from INF, but again, that's someone else's topic for a different time. With that, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Wow, thank you for that. That was fantastic and a part of history that I think very few people know about, because the 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 information about TEL-2 was only recently or fairly recently declassified. Is that correct?
Reasonably, yes. I've written about TEL-2 since, since 1998, and then published extensively about it over the ensuing years. But it's just not widely known. That's certainly the case.
Yeah. I do have another question, then we'll open it up for other folks that have, I'm sure we'll have questions as well. Your comment about Robert McNamara and the conversion of back from flying for flight platforms to ICBMs, I found really an interesting nugget. And I always had wondered what led to our eventual, deployment of all these ICBMs. And I didn't realize that it was basically his, I guess, vision, if you want to call it that, for converting the stuff over to missiles instead of flight platforms.
Right. It was his Harvard MBA speaking. He said that we could be more effective in destroying Soviet targets using ICBMs for less cost than if we used bombers, because a bomber required tankers, it required crews, it required far more than simply turning a key and launching a ballistic missile. So again, it was all part of his whole notion that he could determine that the US was winning the Vietnam War based on body count. It was number crunching, but he also genuinely believed that the future was ICBMs, and people like Bernie Schriever and others were able to convince him of that and provide the argument and the evidence to support it. But others like Tommy Power, and then, as you know, LeMay was chief of staff until 1965, they opposed very strenuously the elimination of the bomber, because ultimately what the bomber did was provide the SAC alert force with flexibility. You could literally launch the SAC bomber fleet on alert and recall it, and you'd send a very powerful message to the Soviet Union. You couldn't do that with the Minuteman or the Titan fleet, because once you turned the key, they were gone.
Yeah.
So the whole notion of gamesmanship and what the SAC alert force could be used in terms of bargaining was exclusively based on the bomber capability. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that does. Thank you. I'd like to open it up for some other questions, and I do have one in the chat, but I'll open it up for the group to see if anyone wants to ask Robert anything. All right, well, let's go with the question that we have in the chat. So this is from Don Stanton, and Don actually has spoken on this webinar before. He was a P3 pilot.
Okay.
So I think has some common history, probably in some of these types of missions flown in some respects. But he writes, "Thank you so much for your career service and superb presentation. Do you have crew or squadron reunions? And has anyone else published articles on TEL-2?"
Good question. What else exists on TEL-2? I wrote about TEL-2 in my B-47 book, and I've also written about it in my book, Spy Flights and Overflights. And that pretty much exhausts the history of TEL-2. There simply isn't much else out there. I have the declassified SAC histories from the 55th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing. I have the Strategic Reconnaissance Center histories and the SAC histories. And by and large, they are not very helpful beyond organizational sorts of data. Excuse me. If you look, I wrote an article for Air Enthusiast Quarterly about the loss of the Tel-2 at Incirlik. I interviewed Walt Savage and the surviving crew members, and I told their story, which to me was a great tribute to the loss of the 2 crew members on board and also the sacrifices that the Tel-2 crew members made. Walt was exonerated. The Accident Investigation Board determined there should have been somebody on the ground who said, okay, divert somewhere else. We'll get you a guard to protect the airplane. But the fact that they made him land under those conditions, no pilot should have been expected to land under those conditions. And Walt went on to become one of the commanders at the Strategic Reconnaissance Center at SAC headquarters. Certainly not a dismissive position, but instead a recognition of his expertise. So aside from the Air Enthusiast Quarterly article, my chapter 6 of my B-47 book, Spy Flights and Overflights, Volume 1, that pretty much covers everything about Tel-2 in depth. I'm sure people like Dwayne Day and others have mentioned Tel-2 in their own work on the space program, but nothing as exhaustive as what I've done. I'm not trying to blow my horn here. I'm just saying I've dug and dug and dug, and that's about as far as I've gone.
And actually, it was Dwayne, your article that you wrote with Dwayne for the Space Review that
Right.
turned me on to Tel-2.
Right. Right.
Yeah. I do have just a comment. I think this is from Rob Welsh. Rob, I don't know if you can acknowledge if you want to come off mic. I think this is you who put a comment in the chat. Hopefully it is, but I just wanted to read. He was an electronic warfare equipment tech in the with the U.S. Army Security Agency, and he did telemetry intercepts at Tuslog Detachment, Sinop, Turkey, and 2nd U.S. Army Security Agency 2nd Field Station in California. And most of his tracking was with S-band beacons and telemetry. Says, well, in Turkey, I monitored both orbital communications from Valery Buzkovsky and Valentina Tereshkova. Oh, okay.
Right.
Such that I heard Tereshkova transmitting on the S-band frequency. Amazing to hear Russian voice in the S-band beacon frequency.
Absolutely. And I'm so grateful for that comment. I don't want to give the impression that this was Air Force only. Army had a very significant TLENT and monitoring capability, as did the US Navy. In fact, during the absence of the Rivet Ball, after it crashed in Rivet Amber and before the new Cobra Ball arrived, the Navy sent A3 Sky Warriors configured for TLENT with Army personnel on board who were qualified to do this sort of monitoring, and they operated from Shemya. So please let me acknowledge the important contributions of the Army and the Navy in accomplishing these same sorts of missions. There are a series of books by a former ESC guy, and for those of you who are in the community, you know who ESC is. It's the successor to the Air Force Security Service. He has written extensively about this and interviewed a lot of the participants, and he's unequivocal in acknowledging the role of the Army and the Navy. And please, please, please let me reiterate, I certainly did not mean to slight their service or contribution when I discussed Tel-2 and the Air Force role. We're all brothers in arms. You know, we make fun of the anchor clankers and, you know, they make fun of us. We're all still on the same team, and I'm so proud to be part of that team. Thank you very much for reminding me that the Army and the Navy both had an important role here.
All right. I have another question. The comments that you made at the end about, these types of overflights were also useful in monitoring, North Korea, Pakistan, and their launches. What's supposed to be replacing our intel capability?
At this point, I would be anything but cynical when I say that the Air Force is jealous that Space Command now has what they would like to do this, and that's the belief that everything can be reduced to overhead collection capability. Nothing can replace the Cobra ball to be on time, on target at a specific date and location. You can't move a satellite routinely, effectively, to collect on a launch from Pyongyang or Sohai or somewhere in the North Korean area 3 or 4 times when the North Koreans say, oh, satellite's coming, so we won't launch. But you can do that with an aircraft. And the Air Force right now is schizophrenic over the future of its own reconnaissance program. They don't know if they want manned or unmanned reconnaissance. They also don't know if they want a big wing aircraft or if they want a drone or if they want a biz jet like a Gulfstream 5. So these are questions that the Air Force has yet to articulate. And I just don't see that there is a commitment at the 4-star level to champion programs like Cobra Ball, which is the successor to TEL-2, because it isn't glamorous. There is no warfighting associated with it. There's no combat mission. There's no what we're all about. And I grew up in SAC. I served in SAC, and so I'm obviously going to be accused of a bias here. But I think that with the shift in command strategy from what many people viewed to be the bomber world of commanders like Kurt LeMay and John McConnell and others to the fighter pilot community, there just isn't the commitment to replace Cobra Ball with anything in terms of a big wing manned asset. And with the absence of that commitment, I don't know what the future holds. Maybe overhead, maybe a drone, but I doubt its effectiveness.
Any other questions or comments? All right, perhaps not. Got a quiet group tonight. All right. Well, listen, Robert, this was an absolute pleasure. And, again, I would love to extend an invitation to come back. I'm sure you have many other fascinating things that you could regale us with. And I'd love to talk with you about that offline. But I want to thank you again. This was a great presentation this evening. Really appreciate it. And thank you. And to the my loyal audience, please keep in mind September 14th we will be doing a live presentation at the Fusion Warminster. So if you're local, please by all means, we'd love to see you. And we will be doing it on online as well. So looking forward to seeing you guys live and virtually in September. So thanks, and I think we can call it an evening. So take care, everyone.